This is Matthew, and I've been on the internet for at least 2 days straight, just listening to people talk down about the Xbox One and how bad of a console it is because of the fact that Xbox One has not have one game that runs on Xbox One's advertised 1080p 60 frames per second. At best, I believe that one of their games, at best, I don't know which one, but I will look it up for actually a future video. But one of their games actually has the highest, which is 900p at 60 frames per second. But still to this day, Xbox One is the only console out of the 8th generation console war that has not truly matched what they advertised, which is 1080p at 60 frames per second. PlayStation 4 and actually the Wii U both satisfied that challenge with at least one of their games running at 1080p 60 frames per second, which actually the Wii U, believe it or not, is actually in first place in actually that department with all of their games running at 1080p 60 frames per second, and the PlayStation 4 at second place with running a handful of their games at 1080p and 60 frames per second. But the Xbox One just cannot pull it off. They can't make all of their games run on 1080p 60 frames per second, which is what PlayStation 4 and actually Xbox One advertised. One of their advertisement catching is that their games will run on 1080p at 60 frames per second. Sony has lived up to that challenge with some of their games, as well as the Wii U, but the Wii U never really advertised it, but they are capable. But the Xbox One just can't do it. And a lot of people are wondering why not? Why not? I mean, we're talking about Microsoft, one of the largest PC software companies in the world. They own pretty much like 98% of actually the PC market. Why can't they make this gaming console make their games run at 1080p 60 frames per second? And I've been digging into it because I am a nerd. I am a technology buff. So I've been looking into it, and I've been looking at the specs of the Xbox and the specs of the PlayStation 4, and I was trying to figure out why can the PlayStation 4 do it and the Xbox One can't. Now Sony did actually make a statement saying that not all of their games will run 1080p at 60 frames per second. That some of their games will actually run on 1080p 30 frames per second, or some of their games will run on 720p with 60 frames per second. But not all of their games will actually run on 1080p at 60 frames per second. Sony just says that the PS4's hardware capabilities. In theory, Sony says that in theory they thought that they could, but actually they can't. At least Sony admitted that. Microsoft has not admitted that. Microsoft is still advertising that they can do it, but they haven't delivered. So I've been like digging on the internet. I've been trying to figure out why. What is in the Xbox One that they can't reach that margin? I mean, it is mind-boggling. I mean, a lot of fans are claiming false advertisement. A lot of people are saying that that's just Microsoft. And there's just a lot of fanboys out there that just clearly are either Sony fanboys that are saying, oh, PlayStation is just better, and there are some Nintendo fanboys that say that actually Nintendo's better. But I am not gonna be a fanboy because I own a PlayStation 3, I own an Xbox 360, I actually own a Wii. I have played the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One and Wii U, and I'm just not a fanboy. I love all three consoles equally. They have their strengths and they have their weaknesses. I mean, if basically I want a good RPG game, a good storyline game, I will go with Nintendo, because even though this is my personal opinion, even though graphically they are not graphically good as PlayStation 4 and Xbox, they are not as good as Sony and Microsoft. I mean, but their games have excellent stories, excellent plots. Now, actually, if I want like a fast-paced, highly graphical, highly realistic game, then I will go with either Sony or actually Microsoft, depending on the personal depending on like my personal preference or basically what am I in the mood for. But I've been really digging and trying to figure out why Xbox One just can't do the 1080p 60 frames per second. Let's start it out with hard drive space is not a problem. I mean, hard drive space is not really affected by that. So and 500 gigs is relatively small storage anyway. But you know, eventually they're gonna upgrade. Eventually, you know, people are gonna upgrade their hard drives anyway to at least a 2 terabyte because I think that's the maximum PlayStation 4 and Xbox One can hold. But moving on to that, I was looking into their hardware specs, and PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, they both use similar. They both use the same hardware. They're just configured differently. But since I'm talking about the Xbox One, I will focus on the Xbox One. I'm not going to talk about the PlayStation 4. I'm not going to talk about the Wii U. It's going to be Xbox One and why the Xbox One cannot do the 1080p 60 frames per second. Now, let's go on. I'm looking into the Xbox One specs, and I have different web pages up. I'm looking at different things, and the Xbox One uses a AMD 8-core Jaguar processor. Now, basically, you guys are probably thinking, okay, 8 cores, that's pretty high. But their processor is a special processor. They are using an AMD APU processor. Now, that is not a normal processor. APU stands for Accelerated Processor Unit. This is an experimental line of actually AMD processors. AMD have been experimenting with this processor a few years right now, running maybe, like it started maybe like around 2005, somewhere around there. And I was looking into it, and actually the Xbox One and PlayStation 4 both actually, oh, there you go, time PlayStation 4 again. But the Xbox One uses a 3rd generation semi-modified Jaguar processor. Now, I say semi-modified because it's not fully modified. I believe they only modified some of it. But what an APU processor is, it is essentially the CPU and the GPU all in one chip. That one processor does the task of both CPU and GPU. That's how come it has an 8-core processor, because it's doing the jobs of 2, not just 1, 2. That is why it has an 8-core processor. 4 processors are used for CPU, and I believe the other 4 processors are used for the GPU. Now, moving on. Okay, I noticed, and I was digging in more, and the GPU aspect of it is actually a modified AMD Radeon R3 processor. That is the GPU. That is the graphical part of actually the Xbox One. And I was digging more into the AMD Radeon R3 processor, and I noticed a lot of things with it. First of all, it is an integrated processor. So that means that it takes its memory from actually RAM. So that means that the 8 gigabytes of actually RAM that the Xbox One has, it has to share that RAM with the processor because the processor is integrated. That is one thing. That's pretty much why all consoles, all consoles have that problem, because the graphics card is also integrated. Now, moving on, it says that at best maximum, it will use 4 gigabytes. That is the maximum RAM that this processor will actually use, which is actually not that bad. But actually, with only 8 gigabytes of actually RAM, obviously it can't use those 4 gigabytes, because then it will leave only 4 gigabytes left for basically everything else. And the Xbox One says that 5 gigabytes of RAM will automatically be allocated for actually video gaming. So that is a very bad thing. Moving on, the core speed of actually the graphics card is only 600 megahertz. So that means that is basically the speed at which the central unit runs, decides the texture and pixel rates, and most importantly, the speed at which the shader processing unit runs. Now, 600 megahertz is not very fast, but actually most graphic processors run at mostly 800 megahertz to about 900 megahertz. Now that's why the semi modification has come. Now, Xbox One says that without the Kinect, the Xbox One uses, I believe it's up to 30% more graphical power. So that means that 600 megahertz has been clocked up a little bit. I will try to find it right here. It has been clocked up to 853 megahertz. So it actually been juiced up a little bit, but it's still lower than the PlayStation 4's, which with the PlayStation 4 GPU, which has been modified as well to run a little bit higher. Now, the memory bandwidth is actually 25.6 gigabytes per second. Now I'm going to explain to you what that is. It says the Radeon R3 5350 graphics card has a memory bandwidth of 25.6 gigabytes per second. The memory bandwidth is still one of today's most important aspects on a graphics card. The higher it is, the better the graphic card performs at higher resolution. That is right there. That is the money right there. One of the monies right there. It is basically, since 25.6 gigabytes per second is a very low speed, that means that the graphics card cannot perform, it actually won't perform very well at higher resolutions, which is, my opinion, one of the reasons why Xbox One cannot truly achieve the 1080p 60 frames per second. We're moving on. Now, the LA cache is 0 kilobytes because it is actually integrated into it. Actually, since it's an integrated graphics card, it has to use the RAM of actually the it has to use the motherboard's RAM. Now, if you don't know what the L2 cache is, I'm going to tell you. The amount of L2 cache has become an important aspect in today's graphic cards because by reducing the amount of requests the GPU has to make to its memory controller, it reduces the impact of lower memory data transfer rates as well as the power consumption. So that means that the less it asks, the less it has to do. Moving on. The shader processing units, 128 shader processing units. The amount of shader processing units combined with their power defines the overall shading performance of any graphics card. The higher number doesn't necessarily mean better performance because the power varies from architecture to architecture. So basically, that's not really like important, but the maximum resolution is 4096 by 2160, which is I believe going up to 4K. But here is the thing. Here is why, one of the reasons why the Xbox One, in my opinion, will never reach the 1080p 6 frames per second, because it says here the best resolution for maximum performance is only 1366 by 768, which is 720p, which is the highest version of 720p right there. Right there. So basically, it means that the best performance that graphics card could actually run on, it is the maximum performance of 720p due to the physical hardware of the processor. Now, I'm going to make an assumption that due to two reasons of low memory bandwidth as well as the physical limitations of the graphics card itself, that the Xbox One will never, and I mean never, run on truly 1080p 60 frames per second because it is physically impossible impossible. Microsoft dug themselves in a corner by sticking with theories because the fact shows that the Xbox One is physically incapable of running on both 1080p with 60 frames per second. It's physically impossible. They can do 1080p and they could do 60 frames per second, but not at the same time. They cannot run a game on 1080p and 60 frames per second because it's physically impossible due to the hardware that it has. They can make a game run on 1080p with 30 frames per second, or they can make a game run on 720p with 60 frames per second, but they cannot do 1080p and 60 frames per second because the graphics card is just physically not there. Thank you guys for watching. There is my video. So, to sum all this up before I go, the Xbox One cannot do 1080p and 60 frames per second because of the physical limitations of their GPU. That is my video. I am not a Sony fanboy. I am not a Nintendo fanboy. I am not a Microsoft fanboy. I'm sticking to the facts, and this is what this video was about, the facts. There is my facts why Microsoft cannot run, the Microsoft Xbox One cannot run 1080p 60 frames per second. I am Matthew. Thank you guys for watching, and as always, have an awesome day.